I'm so excited to be able to introduce Dr. Chris Feudtner to everyone who will be listening to this webinar. Chris is a pediatrician, clinical investigator, and ethicist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, better known to most of us as CHOP. He is also professor of pediatrics, medical ethics, and health policy at the University of Pennsylvania, with that focus on improving the lives of children with complex chronic conditions and their families. He's also an attending physician and chief of division of General Pediatrics at CHOP, the director of the Department of Medical Ethics, where he holds the Stephen D. Handler Endowed Chair of Medical Ethics. And he's also the director of research for the Pediatric Advanced Care Team, which provides palliative, end-of-life, and bereavement services, as well as the complex care services, which cares for hospitalized children with chronic conditions and technology-based healthcare needs. Chris has published over 300 articles regarding pediatric palliative care, epidemiology, health services, use and quality, child outcomes, and medical ethics. Over the years, he has conducted a wide variety of research projects, published more than 300 articles, as mentioned, and has been intimately involved in developing clinical programs while also taking care of complex pediatric patients, including providing palliative care, as well as providing clinical ethic consultations. He lives just outside of Philadelphia with his wife, who's also a physician, 3 children, 2 are in college, and a very energetic morning dog that goes running with him, whose name is Rita. I'll always actually remember the first time that I heard Chris speak. It was probably more than 15 years ago now. He introduced the concept to me about hopes in plural and not singular hope for children with cancer and their families. And that really changed my ability to find peace in my life, and have shared that with so many families since that over the years, just helping them to move beyond just hope for a cure to finding multiple hopes through this very difficult journey. So thank you, Chris. We really appreciate you so much. You've contributed to several chapters in our books that have been published, and thousands, tens of thousands have been distributed to families over the years. So we're very grateful and looking forward to hearing to your talk today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And let me navigate the conversion over to my slide deck so we can get going. Okay, at this point, everybody should be seeing the opening slide. So I just want to thank Ruth and ACCO for this opportunity to talk with all of you and welcome you. One of the ironies of COVID, we've been distanced, but I'm welcoming you into my home. My children's artwork from admittedly quite some years back is on the wall behind me. And you'll see throughout this talk, I am going to use images of nature, and in this case, a path through the woods that at times may not be at all clear and may at times feel really uncertain and even dangerous or scary. But we're going to be talking about this journey that nobody wants to take, but if you're cast in a situation where you have to, how to take it step by step. Prior to today, the good folks at ACCO had asked for questions, and a couple of questions came in. We'll talk about them again at the end. But roughly speaking, there were questions that really asked about facts, concerns, lingering concerns long after the child had died, about the causes of cancer, about the outcomes and how they might have been different if the child had been older or younger, about ongoing efforts to improve outcomes, minimize treatment side effects. And those are a very important bucket of questions that are very legitimate and really can be preoccupying to people. I'm going to, however, focus on another bucket of questions, some of which are asked explicitly, some of which are hinted at, which really have to do less with facts and more with feelings. Feelings of sadness and pain, sorrow, grief, whatever we want to call that set of emotions that just is so difficult. We're going to talk about anger and feelings that this was not right in some kind of metaphysical or global sense, or anger at specific things that happened, feelings of guilt, and the pain that comes with that. We'll talk about when parents cope differently, and why that can happen. And although there's no panaceas in this talk, there's no magic wand, what are some strategies of trying to figure out how to help dialogue when people are coping differently? And as Ruth said at the outset, we will be talking about hope, and more concretely hopes and how they work. One of the questions that was asked about me, and is this a talk from my professional background? Am I a bereaved parent? And I am not, much to my relief, a bereaved parent, but I do need to preface this talk, and I'm going to use it throughout, by talking about my sister, Beth. I was almost 7 years of age when Beth was born. My brother and I were already established members of the family. My mother and father were growing, and Beth was born with Down syndrome. It was not immediately diagnosed. It was actually diagnosed about 3 weeks after she was born, when she was hospitalized for another reason. And I could get lost in talking about stories about Beth, about the medical care that she received early in her life, and many feelings I have to this day of her being discriminated against, and the way that my parents had the news broken to them that she had Down syndrome, by basically reading a little placard in front of her, her bassinet, and not actually being told, that frankly still get me upset. And I will use the word a couple of times, even angry. But to focus on that part really misses the bigger story of my relationship with Beth, which was one of immense pride and joy in just her, in herness, what she was, who she was, how she was as a person, every bit as vibrant and as complete as I could ever hope for in a sister. And then when she was 25, she developed an illness. I got the call from my parents that she had fainted in the kitchen. I rushed to the local hospital where she had been brought, and it was clear she was profoundly anemic. And looking at the CBC, the complete blood count, and calling a friend of mine who happened to be further ahead, I was still just finishing medical school at that point, about to go to pediatric residency. I called a friend of mine who was already embarking in HEMONC fellowship training, and Steve reviewed the case with me. I speak of it so objectively, but I told him about what was happening with Beth and the lab values, and he confirmed what I was worried about, that the initial CBC strongly suggested that she might have leukemia, and particularly AML. Because of the way that healthcare operates in an emergency setting, and lack of immediate ability to access oncology input, I'm actually the first one who told my parents about the likely diagnosis that was then confirmed a couple of days later with a bone marrow biopsy. And then I'm the one who actually told Beth about the cancer and helped her start to understand what was going on in her body, and equally challenging, what was going to be done to try to take the best care of her. I will condense a 2-year story. Suffice to say that unfortunately, after achieving remission, she relapsed. And after 9 months of relapse, she died. For me, what I learned in my bereavement about Beth was that bereavement for me was about grief, but it was about much more than just feelings of sadness. For me, it was a mix of all of these emotions, of sorrow and grief and longing, missing her, but also on the red spectrum, the more hot spectrum of my feelings, I revisited so many decisions that we had made as a family, and I had had a hand in shaping with her treatment team about what to do up front, and then particularly when she relapsed. And it was impossible to not go back in my mind and revisit those decisions. I felt anger. I still, if I get quiet enough and my mood is right, I can still feel some of that anger about things that happened to her when she was taken to get a MUGA scan to assess the function of her heart to make sure that the chemotherapy was not damaging it and she could have another round. She was essentially abandoned on a gurney in the bowels of the hospital alone, cold. And I found her down there when nobody seemed to know where she was. And you can tell even now, I get a little bit, let's just say my Irish temper comes up over recalling that. And also all the doubts that go along with that about, again, what if we had done things differently? These can be written out as words, but they all collide together. And my bereavement was some kind of very complex intersection of all these feelings and not a very stable orbit. You know, one moment I'd be feeling one thing and the next moment I'd be feeling something else. One of the things I noticed, and I still notice to this day, is when I'm doing the most innocuous thing, I'll be doing dishes and I'll just start to cry. And I'm like, what? Well, frankly, what is up with that? We'll come back to that. The unbidden nature of, unpredictable nature of when these feelings are going to essentially flood me. But beyond even these feelings, I had a set of questions about what is my relationship with my sister going to be moving forward? It seemed patently not to be the case that my relationship with Beth was over. It was going to continue, and I was going to have to figure out what that relationship was going to be. And underneath that, I had to figure out what is my relationship with myself going to be. She is woven into me in more ways than I can go to in this talk. And her illness experience and her death and my bereavement was really shaping the way that I was myself. And because it was influencing my own relationship to me, that was affecting my relationship with other people. And I will say without any pride that the 6 months after she died is a period of my life I look back on and think that my conduct, it wasn't egregious or anything like that, but it certainly was not what I typically aim to be as a human being. So my intention in the rest of this talk is to really use my experience of bereavement, admittedly not as a brother, not as a father, not as a parent. I will come back to how important that distinction is, that I am a bereaved brother, not a bereaved parent. And thus my understanding of the bereavement that parents are going through is always going to be limited because, again, I can say with relief, I don't have that experience. But nevertheless, I think the bereavement as a bereaved brother can, combined with my years, literally, I hate to count them, almost 25 years of providing pediatric palliative care, complex care, working with many, many families, working towards hopefully longer life, better life, higher quality of life, but inevitably, unfortunately, sometimes tragically, winding up in a situation where we had to turn to palliative care and to, at some point, bereavement, to be able to illustrate certain points and to pose what have been for me personally useful questions in my own thoughts about my bereavement with my sister, and that I've seen have been useful for many of the parents I have talked to over the years. Some important points I want to make at the beginning. First, bereavement overlaps with, but is different than mental health conditions. Bereavement is forced upon us by circumstances. Mental health conditions may also have that, be true to a degree, but my point here is simply, please, if you are listening to this and you are struggling with anxiety, depression, or other mental health conditions, a webinar or just focusing on the bereavement side of this overlapping set of problems is not going to be sufficient. Please seek the help that can help you and the professional help that can help you. The second is the bereavement varies greatly. You see two people, they may have even suffered exactly the same loss. They may be a couple, they may be family members, they had the same loved one who died. And yet bereavement varies. It varies greatly across these individuals. It varies very pronounced in a pronounced way across cultures. It varies over time. Many of the ways that we think about managing grief appropriately or doing grief in 2022 in the US looked very different in the US context 100 years ago, or looks very different today in another part of the globe, or even across the US with all of its different cultures. In other words, it's not really clear that anybody should presume that there's a proper way to grieve and have bereavement unfold as an experience. There's a wide variety. And maybe the most important question to keep coming back is my bereavement hurting me? Is it doing something to me that I really need to take steps to try to change? Because this is not, it's painful, inevitably going to be painful, but is it actually harming me or the people around me who I love? With that one question answered no, then all the variations in bereavement are probably both not only seen in the world, but acceptable, or we should be accommodating of them. Parental bereavement is also different than spousal bereavement, brotherly sibling bereavement. And why is it different? Well, empirically, we know, meaning when we do studies of people who are bereaved, the journey of grief for many people who lose adults who they love as adults, spouses, children who lose their adult parents, typically the journey never really ends, but most of the heavy lifting is completed in about 2 years, maybe even a little bit less. And parental bereavement appears to go on for a decade, at least. I'm sure if we did longer follow-up studies, we may find that for many people, it is a lifetime of doing heavy lifting. Why would that be? Well, one can have a number of different explanations. I don't think that we know for sure, but given that parenting is personally transformative, meaning when one becomes a parent, one changes what one is. Maybe you've prepared to be a parent, you've dreamt about being a parent, but there is clearly a process of becoming a parent, of the bonds that are created that are incredibly transformative to many, many people. And to go into bereavement is going to be more personally transformative. The other side of this is that it is clear that when parents try to share their feelings of pain and bereavement with other people who have not experienced this kind of a loss, is very difficult for those other people to stay with them. It's too hot to handle. And the result is that it can be very isolating for parents to be able to have anybody to turn to talk about, to share what they are going through with. Parental bereavement treatment, and I put treatment in brackets because there's a number of different things that might be done to help, likely needs to be different than the kinds of treatments, whether they are the cultural rituals, whether they are therapeutic interventions, likely needs to be different than what is supportive of and sufficient for most people who experience bereavement of an adult loved one, because of everything that I just outlined. And there's evidence in some of the clinical trials that have been done looking at bereavement interventions that while they seem to work, depending on the study and depending on the treatment, to help adults with adult level bereavement, they don't seem to work or as uniformly work or work as well for parental bereavement. What I'm just going to put out there with little evidence, I have to be very clear about this. I wish that we knew what did work well. That for me, some of the things that helped me in that journey down that path, that scary path and painful path of coming to grips with what life was going to look like for me once Beth had died, what our relationship was going to look like. These are some words that have helped me in concepts: acceptance, curiosity, commitment. And I will come back to them a couple of times in this talk. Let's start with that middle word of curiosity. I believe that questions are part of the answer. When I heard different phrases offered up both when Beth had gotten sick, all the way back when Beth had been born. Frankly, my parents were told things that really, in retrospect, who says that kind of thing? But you have to get over it. What does that actually mean? Like, quite physically, are we talking about that there's a big chasm in front of me, and if I could just jump over it, whatever it is, I'm not even really sure what it is, or if there's a wall I have to scale? They don't really tell you what's on the other side of that. And maybe this is just not very helpful sloganism. Other images that I have thought of, and I've heard people talk about, like the weight, the burden that one carries, all the voices in my head, and the pressure, and the fears, and the worries, and the anxieties, a feeling of just frankly missingness or emptiness in the core, that something has been removed and I'm incomplete, or an oppressive sense of just unrelenting gloom and doubt. All of these are, I think, mental models that we don't really pull out and think about. They can pop up in our language, the way we talk to each other. But I will come back to a couple of these, because I think that there's room for us to think a little bit of intentionality, of just bringing it into our viewfinder and looking at how these little phrases may give us clues of the kind of work we could do to imagine how we go from this to something different. And when we go from this to something different, I had to come to grips with the fact that the concept of healing, which often is a return to health, like you're going back to where you were, and literally that's what often people say, a return to health, may not be accurate. That part of what I had to come to grips with is that healing for me was going to mean moving and changing into something new. And that was both scary, and it also felt like maybe I'm abandoning my sister, and maybe I don't want that. But it became clear to me that part of what I needed to do was to ask the question of myself, I am going to change. What do I want to change into? Now, because I maybe overlike ridiculously complex diagrams, let me go on a little bit about these different questions that came up for me. They're numbered in the blue numbers. So number one, where is Beth now? And that's a profound question. I'm not going to have anything particularly compelling to say on that. Everybody has a different faith, different set of beliefs. And yet I just want to make it clear that is, for many people, an incredibly important question. The second question, what, after I became bereaved, what has changed in me? What is that missingness? And how do I want to change moving forward, as I was just alluding to? And part of that, how am I going to change, is the question I raised earlier, number three, what on earth, or maybe not on earth, maybe elsewhere, is my relationship between my sister, Beth? And what is her relationship to me as I continue to change? And how do I nurture that relationship? What relationship, what responsibility and duty do I have to that relationship? If that's changing as I move forward, does that mean I have to rethink the past that we had together? And how do I want to remember the past and honor it and use it as we head towards number five, what our future together will be? And I still have, I believe, a very deep relationship with my sister that has gone through now 25 years of not being together, but we are still moving forward. And lastly, what does all of this mean? Number six, about bigger questions. Again, maybe about faith, about why things happen. And I hate to cop out on this one as well, but number one, number six, those are huge questions. I am mostly going to be paying attention to questions 2 through 5. I think that answers to questions 2 to 5, me, my relationship with Beth, our past, our future, has helped me to think about 1 and 6. Where is she now? And what does this all mean? But I don't want to, by not addressing them, say that they are not important. It's just everybody has different answers to those huge questions. To me, clearly, bereavement is both light and shadow. And when I say that, one meaning is that we in bereavement, everybody in bereavement, has both negative and positive feelings that are coexisting. Now, people often think, well, that's not possible. When I'm bereaved, when I'm grieving, there's nothing but negative. Well, hold on for just a minute and let's think about that and look at it and realize that maybe the pain in part is because of the persisting positive feelings. Almost like treble and bass, one can have both positive and negative feelings simultaneously. It's not like a volume dial where the feelings are either turned up towards positive or turned down towards negative. You can actually have both. We've studied the feelings that parents of children receiving palliative care have using a questionnaire that really captures quite well over the last week experiences and feelings of positive and negative emotion. And one of the things we've seen compared to other groups of people, parents have very high levels of negative feelings. No surprise, their child is very, very ill. But critically important, and one of the blessings in my life has been to work with parents and do research that has opened my eyes to things. And one of the things that research opened my eyes to was that they also have incredibly high levels in the mix of everything that is going often really wrong, very positive feelings. And they need to be understood, appreciated, and honored and respected. What I think of often is that the parents and people like myself, physicians, nurses, other people who care for children and families, have to help this balancing act that we're all doing of the negative feelings because the situation is so adverse and the positive feelings. What are these positive feelings? Love, commitment, pride, joy in the existence, the very being, the essence of the child that we love. For me, when Beth was young and healthy, I already was starting down this journey, not of bereavement, but of just serious illness, and not that Down syndrome is a serious illness, but even as a condition that had a lot of discrimination and had some health consequences. I was already dealing with, as a 7-year-old, my feelings of love, friendship, devotion to Beth, and incipient, early, ill-formed, but increasingly articulate anger over the discrimination and the injustice of how people would treat her from time to time, and thinking about advocacy and such like that. When Beth became ill, my high levels of these feelings became extreme. I was overwhelmed with anxiety, dread, and fear about what was going to happen to her, and about my ability to help her, not as a doctor so much, but really as a brother of somebody who was going to be, I felt called upon, and I welcomed being called upon to help guide her through her own personal journey of dealing with this illness. Both of them got dialed up is the point that I want to make here, that part of the way that we stay in balance is that as the negative feelings get turned up, often there's a compensatory turning up of the other, or a heightening or an added appreciation of the feelings of love, friendship, devotion. And that was certainly true for me. And when Beth died, I have to say, and I left it here and I just crossed it out because I want to talk about this. The morning after she had died, I woke up and felt two things almost immediately. One is I felt quiet. And I had not felt quiet in 2 years. And then I felt guilty. I felt guilty because I felt inwardly embodied almost a sense of relief. I went for a walk with my mom and I confided in her, like, I feel totally weird because I'm realizing I don't have to be worried anymore about what's going to happen because it happened yesterday. And one never wants to say this, but given what could have happened, Beth was always comfortable, never in pain, never in fear. When her process very acutely happened of becoming unconscious and then dying several hours later, that had already happened. I didn't have to have anxiety and dread about what was going to unfold. And my mom confided, like, oh my God, I'm sort of freaked out because I'm also feeling totally weird because we had seen this coming for so long and we had been filled with nothing but these feelings of anxiety and dread. And now to have that back there yesterday and not have actively to think about that now, and now have a very different set of feelings of just having the time to be sad and without having to think of what are we going to do next? What are we going to do next? I have talked to parents over the years about this, the day or two after the child has died. And it is such a recurring experience that I just want to, almost a public service announcement, make it clear that I think that this is very understandable, that love worries. And when the loved one, having died, is no longer directly in a certain kind of harm's way, because things have already unfolded, there is often a palpable sense of relief. And I, for one, have come to the point where I don't feel guilty about that anymore. I feel like that was the natural resolution of fear, dread, and anxiety over particular worries that I had, very concrete worries. And what I was left with were feelings of still some anger that, as I mentioned, lingers about discrimination, injustice, and frankly, just anger that this has happened, that this had happened to her and to my parents and my brother, but mostly that it had happened to Beth. A lot of sadness and sorrow and this emptiness or feeling of lostness, of like literally we went on a walk and just wandered around. We were almost incapable of figuring out where to go. What to do with these negative feelings? I had used these words acceptance and commitment earlier, and I want to come back to that. When I say acceptance, I don't mean needing to accept what has happened in the reality of everything. I'm talking about a more personal acceptance, that I needed to accept the feelings that I was having and the reactions to what had happened with Beth. My art skills here are definitely being challenged. This is meant to be somebody poking their head up out of a gopher hole, of looking around and trying to feel what I was feeling, and then I would go back down underground. I didn't do this all at once. Coping for me and for many people is advancing, trying to come to grips with a feeling like fear or anxiety or guilt, retreating when it got too hot to handle, regrouping, advancing, repeating. This sort of dual process of advance and retreat is very much a way that I understood and still understand the way that we cope in general. Nobody deals with things 24/7, 365 that are difficult. We do it in phases. And over time, acceptance for me has meant becoming a little bit more comfortable with the range of feelings that Beth's illness and death brought out in me, so that I could start to process them. But never mind the processing, that sounds too highfalutin. I could simply experience them and let them be in me for a while before I felt like I needed to pop my head back under and escape. At the same time, as I was trying to get to a point of accepting many of those feelings, which were painful, is I knew from who Beth was and what we had talked about so many times and her own modus vivendi, the way that she was in the world, that she would want me to be looking forward and to figure out on my compass of feelings how to keep moving forward. Some of those feelings, like anger, I actually have come to realize I can't act on. It can be very destructive, but it usually is pointing at a problem, a point on the compass that maybe I want to pay attention to and see whether in a constructive way I could tackle, for instance, a patient being left in the bowels of a hospital after a scan. But in other regards, it's simply, to me, a commitment to trying to look forward and to move forward, to be able to continue to be a positive influence for those people around me. That acceptance and commitment has been very helpful for me as I have tried to move forward. At the same time, and what we want to make sure we have time for, is how do you keep these feelings? I have a lovely wife, 3 fabulous children. Both my parents have also died, so I'm in bereavement for them. How do I keep the love and, frankly, familial friendship and devotion that I had to all of them? Thank goodness my brother is alive and well. But for those people, how do I keep those feelings that were so important to me, continue to nurture them as being so important to me? And that's what we're going to talk about next. Now, hope has many different meanings. If you talk to people about hope, part of me actually finds it remarkable that something as important as hope, which I am willing to put out there, is a fundamental human attribute that may be the precursor for everything that we do in life that is worth doing, that doesn't just come to us easily, that takes any effort. It is hope that allows us to move into difficulty and endure delayed gratification. It is hope that allows us to surmount obstacles. It is hope that moves us forward in so many ways. You would think that we would actually take it more seriously. But metaphorically, I think you can get pretty far down the road of understanding what hope is by drawing an analogy to water. So what is hope? Well, some of it, one attribute of it, is it's a feeling. It is a optimistic, I'm hopeful, I feel good about that. And you can think of that as sort of the vaporous or gaseous form of hope. Operationally, though, if you're trying to get to that feeling, which many of us, we want that feeling, but how do you get there? Is to actually realize that hope actually has a solid, concrete form that are very distinct, a distinct thought, or more often, a set of thoughts, a group of hopes. And we'll come back to this in a minute, that group of hopes, if you take some time and actually just visualize what they are, tell them to yourself. Sometimes it is painful to actually admit what they all are, but in a kind and gentle way with yourself. This is the acceptance part of accepting the range of hopes that you might have. You might be able to start to feel more hopeful as you realize that there are many important aspects of the situation that we are paying attention to and are hopeful about. Now, we've done research on this. One such study where we had parents, mothers, and fathers of children with serious illness receiving palliative care. We asked them what they were hoping for, and we went through different categories of things, and they could say, yes, I am hoping for that, or no. Are you hoping for a cure for your child? Are you hoping for added longevity? Are you hoping that their body can be fixed or something that is wrong with the body addressed? Maybe it's the processes of care that you're hoping can be improved, or knowledge about the condition, or a reduction in suffering, an improvement in the quality of life, or hoping for more meaning. And what you will see is, one, fathers and mothers aren't identical, but they're not that different overall. Although couples often are not on the same page, mothers and fathers often have multiple hopes. This is the point I really want to make. They don't put all of their pennies in one bucket. They're often thinking about a couple of these different areas. But if you don't realize that hope is actually hopes, and you stop at the end of the first thing that they may mention that they're hoping for, and not see what else they are hoping for, you might have not fully understood what they're thinking. So I just spoke there as a clinician. Let me turn that around and think about if I were talking to my wife about what she is hoping for, and she said one thing and then I said another thing, we might say that those two things are different. But if we carried on the conversation and said, what else? Thank you. What else are you hoping for? I just need to know and explore and learn and not so much interject. If I keep going, we might find when we put all of the things that we're hoping for in front of us, like on a table, we might realize that there's a lot of overlap. But to get there, we need to have a nurturing dialogue about what we are hoping for, with multiple hopes potentially coming out of that. And hope, lastly, like water, is not just a vapor or a solid chunk of ice. It has a liquid quality. It can become, once you start to really think about and work with hope, it becomes a pattern of thinking that allows you over time to cope and adapt to a world that does not always cooperate with what we are hoping for. In the same study I mentioned, one of the things we looked at is that parents do, over the course of a 2-year period of time, shift what they're hoping for. Not necessarily dramatically, but to a degree that may be actually helping them take the best care of their child as the situation unfolds. And that kind of fluidness of hopeful patterns of thinking, I really think is helpful to nurture. So this whole cycle, it's like the water cycle of actually having distinct thoughts and cultivating them, and that then potentially allowing your mind and your body and your soul to think about how you would potentially work with those hopes, and things starting to flow may actually result in a greater feeling of hopefulness. Not a panacea. I can't emphasize this enough. There is no way to make everything right as rain. This isn't magic. But what this is very human. It's very oriented towards trying to figure out how to cope and to move forward. It's about this concept of resilience, but maybe it's the inner workings or one attribute of resilience, along with the resources that you can mobilize around you, that will help adapt and change and move forward over time. For me, my hopes after Beth died were that I would never lose her presence in my life, that I would never lose her joy, but also, weird to say, but I think many can relate to it, I would also never lose my sorrow. I never wanted to get to the point where the fact that she can't be with me now, when we have key celebratory moments in my family's life, that Beth cannot partake in them. There's a bit of me, the fact that, for instance, my wife, Linda, never had a chance to meet Beth and vice versa. That definitely, I wish that were not the way life had unfolded. That I would find a way to put the anger I felt to good use, already hinting at sort of my commitment that I wanted to feel the anger, but I wanted to be committed to putting it to good use. And that I would remember the good times ultimately more than the bad times. After Beth died, I was haunted by, for 2 years, nothing but negative images of her being sick. And I remember getting sort of fed up at some point, like, when am I going to remember Beth healthy? Because she was healthy for 25 years and then 2 years of illness, and all I'm stuck with are the tapes of the last 2 years. And I hoped that that would change. And I am here to report that it did. But that was at the time only a hope that I had. And then I would remember her honestly. And we could talk about that at length. I think I do my sister the biggest honor by remembering her honestly, not putting her up on a pedestal, letting her be who she was on her own terms, and being very faithful to that honest representation. And then I would support my parents in their bereavement journey. Those are things that I was hoping for. Looking back, looking at what I was scratching out to myself in little notes, this is what I was trying to figure out. So for me, it felt like a big burden. This really resonates with me. It felt like I was carrying something on my back after Beth died, and it was sticking, right? Like a little part of this bundle was like sticking right in the angle of my jaw. And every time I moved, it would hurt. And I just kept up with that image and thinking, can I repack this somehow? Can I redistribute it? I don't want to drop the burden. I want to carry forever my feelings about my sister. I don't want this just to roll away and I walk off and I look like I did before. I want to carry it, but I want to repack it. I want to carry it like a little backpack. And here's me with my dog Rita with a little backpack that I go around the neighborhood, and I realized it was apt for this talk, with a 30-pound weight in that little backpack. Definitely, I feel it, but it's comfortable, and I'm very content to walk around with that on my back. And that to me is how I now carry many of the feelings that I have about Beth, both the painful and the sorrowful ones, but also the laughter and the joy. They're in my backpack. I can pull them out. Often they will sneak out, as I said, when I'm doing the dishes or just randomly. There are times of the year where I purposefully unpack that, but I am carrying that all the time, and I am okay with that. There's a line from an essay by Richard Steele entitled "An Hour or Two Sacred to Sorrow." And this is the other acceptance part, that I am not afraid of being sad or of embracing those unbidden moments where I actually just feel sorrowful. They tend not to last that long. I don't want to make it sound like it's a hour or two. It probably often is much less, but the acceptance of I am feeling that feeling and not chasing it away has been very important to me. I'm going to shift in the last part of this talk to talk about the foundation. And the foundation here, like a nurse log, is being a parent that gives growth to so many things down the line. I said already that a parent is different than other relationships with loved ones. The amount of attachment, it's bi-directional. We talk about children attaching to parents. That in part happens because the parents attach to the child. And this overweening sense of duty, probably a stronger sense of duty to a child than practically any other relationship that we have. These aspects make being a parent different than other relationships. Different, although I was very attached and I had a strong sense of duty to my sister, my parents had a stronger, and I honor that their attachment and their sense of duty was something I always marveled at and admired. Part of the issue, though, just like I was talking about hopes and how parents may actually hold a bundle of hopes, a bouquet of hopes, and if we don't take care to ask them about what is each hope in their bouquet, and they just put down the first flower, we may not realize that there were other hopes in their bouquet. Parents self-define their duties very differently. And we don't talk about these hardly at all. And clinically, we don't do this much. We also don't do it even in our casual conversations about being a parent. And what do I mean by these self-defined duties? Well, we've studied this as well with parents of seriously ill children. We've written it up. This again is self-defined. This is work that Pam Hines, my colleague, and then we joined forces, had done over years qualitatively, just listening to parents say what they felt they needed to do to be a good parent or a loving parent. And they felt over the years, we heard, I need to advocate for my child. I need to focus on my child as having a long life as possible, my child's comfort, health, quality of life, spiritual well-being. I need to keep a positive outlook. I need to keep a realistic outlook. I need to make informed medical care decisions. I need to make sure my child feels loved. I need to put my child's needs above my own. I need to stay at my child's sides. These are just a sample pretty robust sample, but a sample of what we heard. We were able to go with parents, 200 parents, and actually have them look at this list and pick the ones that were most important to them. And through a technique I won't go into, be able to come up with a way of looking at how important these were across the whole sample. Now, what this very busy chart says, at the top, if you were to ask the question, which of those feelings of a good parent self-defined belief are most strongly felt as important by the parents, it was making sure my child feels loved. It had the highest importance score. But the point I want to make here is the variation. So these little box and whisker plots, they're called, the vertical white stripe in the middle of the box says half the people were above that white stripe, half were below. But the total width of the box with that little tail shows you what the highest scores were and what the lowest scores were, more or less. And you can see that for any one of those characteristics, all the way from the top one, making sure my child feels loved, for some people that was very, very low. And you go down to the bottom where my child's spiritual well-being, because I think many parents view that as a responsibility that is in a higher power's command or control. They didn't rate that as a personal feeling that they had to take on their own responsibility. But for some parents, it was the number one responsibility of importance. So right here you see, and I say this all the time, that my main clinical intervention is to ask questions, because I don't read minds. I don't know what people are thinking or feeling. I need to be curious and see what do they see for themselves. Conversations about, I've talked to many parents, and they often have a sense inside that they feel very strongly about what they need to do to be a good parent. I'll ask that to parents, do you have a feeling like that for yourself? And at first, they may not fully understand what I'm going after, and I give them a couple of examples, and usually the penny drops at some point. They're like, oh, I get it. Well, for me, I feel the most important thing is staying at my kid's side. I can't stomach the thought of not being with my son or daughter if they're in the hospital. I feel a compulsion to be here. But they vary. And unless I ask that question, I don't know what answer they feel most strongly. And somewhat sadly, often nobody has asked them that question before. Nobody has knocked on the door and entered the room of their own inner private sense of duty. And because they're in there working really hard, and the door never got opened into a conversation about what's your sense of duty, they're doing it alone and rather isolated. And when we talk about couples, they often, when I've asked them either separately or sometimes we're all together and we ask, it's not unusual at all that the two parents, the couple, may actually have very differing answers to that. And they're often somewhat surprised that they didn't really, they knew it sort of, but they had never talked about it. And to be able to make it speakable allows them to start to look at how their differing senses of what they feel they need to do, they may contrast, but they also can complement each other, that they can essentially round out the type of, and make more complete the type of loving care and a sense of how we can be best as parents together for their child. Now, when my sister was alive, I already had internalized this kind of conversation with myself of what I needed to do to be a good brother. And into my bereavement, this still guides me. The past into the present, you might say the same question I'm going to suggest can help parents. Couples may have different answers to this question. Exploring these differences and seeking complementarity of how the two fit together, and 1 + 1 = 2, not 1 + 1 is at odds, but how they add together can be very helpful. So we've covered a lot of ground. I wish I could come up with a solution. As I've already said, there's no panacea. At least I have not discovered one. There's no universal treatment. There's no recommendation that will work for everybody. But what happens next when some of the parts don't really add up? When no matter what you do, you're still stuck with questions you can't answer. Now, I've explored some of this in a book of stories, a novel tracing the life of a intern in pediatrics. So it's not written from a parent's point of view, although parents figure prominently in these 12 months of a intern's year and different stories about the emotional dynamics and the resulting personal professional changes that it brought about in the intern, in colleagues, and even in the parents and the children. And one of the stories, the last one, has the protagonist, Rob, the main character. He's walking after sort of signing out very late one evening. Late evening became an early morning. He's completing sign out, trying to come in to work for the day. And he walks by a statue in the middle of a garden on the grounds of the hospital. And the statue has a little plaque, and he just hadn't noticed it. And he sort of looks at it, and it has this inscription. And why, when confronted with a question you cannot answer, you can still respond. I don't even know that I fully knew why I wrote this, but it does seem to me that so much of my professional journey and even my bereavement journey, I have been left with questions that I cannot answer. But I have to find ways as a physician entrusted to take care of children, entrusted to help families, to find ways to respond. I come back to things I've already mentioned. The commitment for me of trying to find a path forward where I can be help to other people. And both within myself and in my dialogue with other people, be willing to knock on that door, open it, and accepting of what actually we wind up talking about. Either this complicated relationship I have with myself, or the relationship I have with other people. Commitment, curiosity, a willingness to ask questions, open doors, and see what you find and what you can share. Very, very important ways to respond, even if I don't know the answers to the questions. I do believe ultimately, as I emphasized at the beginning, we have questions about facts, but underneath that, we have questions about feelings and what to do with them. And we have questions about how to continue our bonds with our loved one. And integrating those feelings and those continuing bonds into my continuing life, not as an add-on, but as woven into the fabric of who I am, what I'm trying to accomplish. Not the entirety of it. Again, I feel an insistence on being as honest as I can be, but definitely in the tapestry of who I am, woven into that are my feelings of bereavement that have changed over 25 years, and my continuing relationship with my sister Beth. Self-acceptance about those feelings has helped me. The curiosity about what is going on here, like when I woke up the day after she had died, like what is this feeling of relief about, with the acceptance, and then that commitment of how to be moving in a forward direction have been incredibly helpful. The hopeful thinking and clarifying self-duty are engines that have basically allowed this process to move forward for me, and I hope in one way or another may be helpful for those listening to this webinar. Thank you. I believe at this point we're over to some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Feudtner. I have 3 questions that were submitted to us. So one comes from Kimber. Any suggestions on how to handle life when mom and dad deal with grief very differently? We lost our son, Michael, at the age of 17 due to childhood leukemia almost 9 years ago. He fought valiantly for almost 6 years.
Yeah. I think as a professional, I just have to say, like, I always hesitate to answer a question without actually knowing Kimber, mom and dad, and being able to really speak to the particularities of what they are going through. It's not unique, that's for sure. I'm not sure I would say it's the most common outcome, but it is a very common outcome that two loving parents may wind up handling bereavement and long-term bereavement differently. The guidance that I already gave of gently trying to be curious in a non-judgmental manner about particularly what they each feel that they need to do to be good in their own view. I'm not trying to pass any judgment on anybody, but in their own sense, what do they think that they need to be doing to be good parents to their departed son, or good spouses, and listening without really talking much in a response, because so often what I see is that this is such a painful topic to talk about that people freeze up. The amount of emotionality, certainly if my wife is upset, I immediately start sympathetically to get upset with her, even if I didn't feel it that way. So trying to actually do that kind of work requires a lot of gentleness, and may actually be helped by actually having other support people that can help cushion the emotionality of it. But both parties have to be willing, and it's not always going to work, but doing it together and finding ways, again, that gopher who pops up its head and looks around, then goes back into the hole. You may not be able to do it all at once. It's not going to be an epiphany, but progressively trying to find how to take that conversation a little bit further. And, what are they hoping for in their bereavement? The hopes conversation or a sense of duty conversation, gently over time, would be the way that I would typically think about trying to help.
All right, and the next one is from Lisa. How do you get back to normal after your child has passed away? My best friend said to me, well, hopefully now that it's been a year, you can get back to normal and do the things that you like.
Yeah. I think the friend means well. I think the friend is saying, I hope that you can get back to doing things you enjoy. What the friend doesn't realize is that that particular parent is actually normal. Most parents, as we already mentioned, experience bereavement and grief for many, many years, not 1 year. We hear repeatedly from parents that the second year is far harder after the child has died, in large part because of comments like this, of the second birthday, the second holiday, the second spin around the sun. When you're dealing with a bereavement, our society has an expectation that you're somehow going to be over it. And that's why I call that mental model into question. I don't think I would also use the word go back to being normal. I think that sets us up for that concept of healing as we have to return to where we are. And we probably have misgivings about that. We don't, maybe we do want that, part of us wants that, but we're ambivalent about that, because if I go back to the way I was before, what does that say about my experience of loss and my obligations or my loyalty to my child? I think for me and for many people, the question that might be helpfully different is to say, who am I going to become in my new life? My new life is, we're all actually constantly living a new life. So it's not a profound thought. We're never standing still. We can't, time moves. But if you accept that change is inevitable and actually embracing, who am I going to become? And really thinking about that more intentionally, with perhaps a little bit of a sense of, I am committed to trying to enjoy things, but I'm going to fail often. I'm going to accept when I don't feel like I can have fun. And I'm going to feel whatever feeling I'm having. But I am committed to keep going back and testing the waters of re-engaging in the things that bring me fun, and integrating this ebb and flow of sorrow and pain and anger and guilt and all these feelings they will probably over time change, but I can't rush it. I have to be accepting of the fact that this may take longer than I really want it to, but I'm committed to continuing to try to move forward.
Okay, and lastly, the question is from Jean. I need to know my son's life mattered. How can we ensure kids that survive childhood cancer and don't ultimately pass from the side effects of the chemo years later? Seamus was diagnosed with leukemia at the tender age of 3 with what everyone said was a textbook case, beginning to end. He was diagnosed in December 2003 and celebrated 15 years of survivorship December 16th, 2018. He passed away in his sleep just days later on December 23rd, 2018. His heart stopped. Undetected scarring on his heart from his chemo, but official cause of death is listed as dilated cardiomyopathy. He deserved better. How do we do better?
Yeah. I'm sorry that Seamus had what ultimately unfolded for him. You know, I talked a couple of times about this very important and very difficult and very tricky emotion of anger. I hear in that, like, how do we do better? How do we not have this happen to other patients? And that is something that, again, it needs to be transformed. Anger needs to be transformed to become a positive influence, but that it can point like a needle on a compass to something really important. And that question points to something very, very important about the importance of survivorship. The goal in cancer therapy is, of course, to have the cancer go into remission. But the true goal of cancer therapy is to enable these children to go on and lead happy lives, fulfilling lives. And that's a question of not just the upfront treatment, which is incredibly, I'm not an oncologist. I am amazed at what they are able to accomplish. But even as they are well aware of and are working in the survivorship realm of making sure that the long-term outcomes for children who have had a cancer experience are increasingly positive and not going to be affected by things like cardiac myopathy, injury to the heart that dilates the heart, the myopathy, as well as causing the scarring that led to the arrhythmia, all of that being sort of the same process unfolding, that doesn't happen. Of how do we get those types of processes to not occur? And that ultimately is, again, this commitment to feeling the feeling, and then how do I turn that to positive movement forward in the world? And I think organizations like ACCO and many other organizations that keep emphasizing the importance of how do we help people who survive cancer have full, complete lives. And for those who don't have that, who wind up dying, and those who are bereaved, how do we make sure that we keep moving toward that? Very important.
I want to thank you, Chris. Thank you for sharing Beth with us. It's not easy, as you said. But I think for me, thank you for identifying that the pain of a parent losing a child is different than other loss. And I hope that your talk can give strength to families that have lost their child, who are facing expectations, external expectations to move on, to, return to who they were, to, to adapt to, a life without their child in a very quick way and unreasonably, in so many ways. So I hope that, comes from this. I also hope that they also were able to, as you so beautifully said, have a commitment to moving forward, and also understanding that moving forward is filled with, advancement and retreat and regrouping, and advancement, retreat and regrouping. So I'm so grateful for your wisdom, your expertise, and your personal experience, and also for your work with these families over the years, but also for your work with ACCO over the years. We're very grateful. So thank you. And hopefully this will help other people. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.